Greetings, friends of liberty. One of the greatest pleasures that has sustained me through the years is the extraordinary taste and stimulating effect of tea, which in our British Isles has become increasingly varied in its many types over the last decades. If we patronize the right shops, or we even commission tea agents to search for rare teas in China, India, or Japan, one is often astonished at their finding the most strikingly unique teas imaginable. Amongst these, I would number the champagne of teas, Darjeeling, the many types of Assam tea, and various tea mixtures, such as English breakfast tea, a mixture of Darjeeling and Assam, Irish breakfast, a mixture with a higher percentage of Assam than English breakfast, Earl Grey, famously tinctured, of course, with bergamot, and Lapsang Souchong, possessed of a smoky flavor. Now, when taking my tea, I add so much milk that Marguerite often says that I must be trying to make up from having been weaned too early from my wet nurse as a suckling. Whether that's true, I smile at her indulgently and can hardly imagine a more enjoyable manner of breaking my fast than with potfuls of very milky milk tea with added honey. Of course, in the selection of teas, one must cultivate a discriminating palate, so the smokiness of Lapsang Souchong frankly repels me, as does a large portion of Assam relative to Darjeeling found in Irish and Scottish breakfast. Perhaps it goes without saying that English breakfast would naturally prove superior to both Irish and Scottish. On the other hand, white tea flavored with chestnut or peach is refreshingly light and delicate. Various yellow teas as well, such as Mudan, are very satisfying. And even some green teas, such as the Japanese Bancha or Hojaicha, roasted, are tantalizing. Now, the cultivating of the faculty of discrimination applies not just to teas, but to everything in life. So, for example, there are certain of my male friends who regard large mammary glands on the fair sex as a sine qua non of eligibility. This is frankly absurd, but if a man wants to overvalue such traits at the expense of others, then he will certainly have the opportunity, once married, to repent at his leisure. Can one imagine that if a man had this attraction, that the government should disabuse him of his error, if he has no more sense than that? Now, if we turned the issue of discrimination in teas or anything else in your own 21st century in Great Britain, we find today the paper of Daniel Freeman and Alex Morton, Liberalising Discrimination Law, Why the Equality Act is Unfit for Purpose. In that regard, almost 6 weeks ago, I reviewed Richard Hanania-whose The Origins of Woke, in which Richard correctly, in part, in contrast to most other woke theorists, outlined how various American anti-discrimination statutes of the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 91, especially Title 7 and 9, have increased the intensity and frequency of racist and woke behavior among American institutions and individuals. In this paper, the two authors, like Richard, from their generally classical liberal perspective, not surprising given that they're both members in good standing of the Institute for Economic Affairs, a premier classically liberal think tank, examine these British anti-discrimination laws. The authors summarize the types of anti-racism laws in the UK. Number one, laissez-faire, the belief that there is no role for legislation to stop discrimination. Number two, stopping direct discrimination, i.e. blaming direct discrimination towards individuals, banning. Number three, a structural approach that systemic or institutional or indirect discrimination had to be combated at a system-wide level. And four, anti-racism activism like that of Ibram, Kendi, or DiAngelo. The belief that all gaps between different groups are the result of present and historic systemic prejudice to be eradicated by active anti-discrimination. The authors add that similar changes have applied to biological sex and to areas such as homophobia and other forms of prejudice. Having presented us with this taxonomy, they then give us a brief history of the progression of anti-discrimination law in the UK. Phase number 1. The first and most hands-off approach to discrimination was applied prior to 1965. Broadly, private businesses in Britain were free to discriminate in the provision of goods and services and recruitment practices on whatever grounds they pleased. Not surprisingly, the first push towards racial morals legislation came from Labour. Amongst the first to press for state intervention was the radical Labour MP Fenner Brockway. In June 1956, Brockway began what would be the first of 8 attempts in Parliament to make illegal discrimination to the detriment of any person on the grounds of color, race, and religion in the United Kingdom. All 8 bills were rejected by Parliament. In response, Conservative MPs like Bernard Brain argued instead that it was better to treat the root cause of discrimination through education and persuasion. Economist Milton Friedman across the pond, too, said that in a market, competition would ultimately marginalize the business that prioritized prejudice over profit. This is true. Didn't Milton know what he was talking about? The Bristol Omnibus Company, which was boycotted, was rare in not hiring non-white drivers. Phase number 2. The next phase, as Labour MP Brockway had tried earlier, was to remedy alleged discrimination against individuals with the 1965 Race Relations Act, the first in British history to deal with the question of discrimination committed by private bodies. This excuse or rationalization given was that it would maintain public order. The remit of the act was limited since housing and employment, 2 areas of major contention, were not included, and it remained lawful for shopkeepers to refuse service on explicitly racist grounds, although there's no evidence that this was a widespread occurrence. The authors note that the second approach could also be considered within the Rawlsian liberal frameworks, which argues that liberalism requires us to imagine how we would shape society if we did not know the circumstances of our birth. Both make a liberal, albeit not libertarian, case for moderate intervention. If we did not know our circumstances, we would probably agree that we would not want a society that allowed direct discrimination. A completely imaginary and irrelevant hypothetical. Phase number 3, collective rights. With the 1976 Race Relations Act, group rights were more broadly applied, although they were already embedded in the UK by the Equal Pay Act 1970. This had required that groups of men and women had to be treated equally when pay scales were being drawn up, as determined by judges. The 1976 Act was the last major act of Parliament to touch on the issue of racial discrimination for some time, as from 1979 on, the Conservative government of Margaret Thatcher was in power, whose administration believed that the colorblind nature of the market and capitalist competition were the most effective means of ensuring fairness. Thatcher was right. However, local government in labor-dominated areas used the provisions of the 1976 Act to target services at minority groups and, in some cases, introduce de facto affirmative action. And the scope of the law inexorably expanded. Herman Oesley, chair and chief executive of the Commission for Racial Equality from 1993 to 2000, said, "During my stint, we were not afraid to use the 1976 Act in a very elastic way to support individuals in the tribunals and courts, to challenge employers and public bodies, to undertake formal investigations fearlessly into bodies such as the Ministry of Defense, and generate support to fund public awareness advertising campaigns focused on the effects of racism." And this application of the law became even more expansive with Tony Blair's landslide victory in 1997. Interestingly, the more the law was applied, the more accusations of bigotry multiplied. Various public bodies were accused not just of institutional racism, but also institutional sexism, institutional homophobia, and institutional Islamophobia. This was also driven by the European Court of Justice and European civil ECHR case law that had to be then incorporated into UK law. Finally, progressive phase number 4. By the 2010s, active, persecutory, allegedly anti-racist racism, promoted, of course, by the likes of Ibram Kendi and DiAngelo. In this view, every single group disparity between, for example, whites and blacks is caused by racism, and thus direct reverse racism against whites was claimed necessary. So, for example, treating an individual worse because of their skin color, if, for example, they are white in the USA, is a positive thing to do, according to Kendi. Given that the authors believe in solution 2, which is trying to ban discrimination against individuals, let's now turn to some of the solutions they advocate against 3 and 4, the two versions of collective rights discrimination. Number 1. The authors argue that approach number 4, collective rights and active anti-racism, is bad because it sacrifices other values such as A, privacy, or B, the fact that people of different races, sexes, and sexualities become nervous about engaging with each other in case a particularly fragile member of a minority group takes offense. Secondly, it produces unpleasant victimization and bullying under the guise of educating. It is no surprise that the rise of so-called cancel culture has gone hand in hand with this progressive thinking. This means that the left's obsession with race and racial outcomes has often led to anti-Semitism, since in many countries, Jewish households are more educated and affluent than otherwise. Thirdly, the authors argue there is no way to measure the harms suffered. So, who determines the current and past cost of prejudice to a gay man versus a lesbian woman? What about a black man or a woman who is a very high earner versus a working class white person who lives in a deprived town in the north of England? Fourthly, a collective rights approach can't differentiate people of the same race who are much richer or poorer. So, for example, British Indians are more than twice as likely as white Britons to have a weekly household income of over £2,000, while white Britons are slightly below the national average in terms of household income. This is because British Indian migrants tend to be higher income earners or professionals. They conclude by saying, the government should thus revise the existing legislation to move us back to the anti-discrimination approach originally proposed. Solution 2, it is likely that the next few years will see increasing levels of illiberal and aggressive progressive activism that largely benefits the most privileged within minority groups rather than the generally disadvantaged. So, having seen their portrayal of the increasing severity and unjustness of collective rights anti-discrimination law in Britain, let's evaluate the author's approach and their solutions. Number 1, while they understand that the notion of collective rights is a garbage concept, since rights only accrue to individuals, the first point they don't understand is that all these types of laws are types of morals legislation. And morals legislation never works, whether it's against individuals, their solution 2, or against a group, solutions 4 and 3. So has any law against prostitution ever worked? Against gambling? Against drug or alcohol using or addiction? With the enormously destructive drug wars in the West killing over 100,000 people conservatively a year? Did those work, Daniel and Alex? Or in attacking greedy businesses by imposing price controls? Or with minimum wage laws? How often does that morals legislation work? Never. You might have really thought that the Institute for Economic Affairs would have understood that by now. Price controls are a type of morals legislation, but nothing is more certain in economics that they don't work. If a seller won't accept the market price for his goods, he won't sell very much, so he'll lower his price. The market punishes greed. And so when the authors say direct discrimination against individuals in the public sphere is unacceptable and ending it is simply enforcing equality before the law, this is completely false, since there are thousands of types of potentially immoral actions, not just racism. Are you going to outlaw height discrimination? Discrimination against the skinny or the fat? Against the ugly? Or for some, envious discrimination against the beautiful? Are you going to prevent men from overvaluing and marrying women with an expansive bosom? Or against people who hate blondes or brunettes, whether male or female? The philosopher Ayn Rand disliked men with beards. How are you going to discover and outlaw that? You don't think that's going to compromise people's privacy to discover what Ayn Rand's motivation was for every single person she might have potentially hired or dealt with? And Ayn was never going to vote for a female president. Should she be punished for that, Daniel and Alex? If not, their claim that they're enforcing moral equality before the law is utterly bogus. They're only enforcing a few immoral actions over hundreds of others that aren't privileged, completely unequal before the law. Number two, what they also don't understand is that sometimes discrimination can actually be practical. For some people in some situations, often when we don't know much or can't discover much about another person, but only know the characteristics of their group. Thomas Sowell calls this discrimination 1B. Have the authors ever heard of it? And this is because people with different skin colors often have different ethnicities or ethnic traits, too. So race grifter Jesse Jackson himself said he would go to the other side of the street if he met a black man at night in an alleyway. Prudent in some situations. Similarly, as Richard Epstein notes, if a condominium owner wants to restrict his clientele to senior citizens, that's his prerogative, so that the elderly might not be knocked off their feet by some rambunctious kid or teenager. Or let's imagine you have an elderly, frail condominium owner who lives in an American society where blacks are 10 times more violent than whites. Is it irrational for him not to sublet his apartments to black tenants? Really? He has to take the risk of being subject to violence or non-payment of rent? That's moral, Daniel and Alex? Thus, what Solution 2, individual anti-discrimination law, assumes is that perfect knowledge is attainable, but there is no way to know how much a person should be compensated because you would have to know his life in great detail. Is that violent tenant not going to lie? And so when the authors say the idea that the only objective of society is to end all forms of prejudice is totalitarian, any type of morals legislation, if it wants to be fair and cover hundreds of different immoral actions, is totalitarian, if the authors want to be fair. Number three, the authors claim overt acts of discrimination in public places, intensely wounding to the feelings of those against whom these acts are practiced, perhaps in the presence of many onlookers, breed the ill will which may disturb the peace. What naivete! They don't understand that nowadays any retailer who engaged in race discrimination would face, in this era of social media with constant recording by smartphones, a quick and severe backlash. This is how little these two alleged classical liberals understand about the corrected mechanisms of civil society in a free country. Happy for my part to live in England, where people can discriminate against others to their heart's content, but who will certainly face the negative consequences of their discriminatory actions if necessary. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.